Hey guys, this is going to be practical number 3, the vertebral column. Most of you know a lot about the vertebral column, so let's start with the fact that we have 7 cervical, we have 12 thoracic, and we have 5 lumbar. Starting at the top, we have 2 very unique lumbar vertebra, cervical vertebra. This is the atlas, that would be C1. This is the axis, that would be C2, and they actually fit together like this, and the occipital condyles of the skull actually sit on the superior articulating facets of the atlas. This is called the dens. This is actually what the head kind of rotates on when you turn your head and rotate your head. Of course, there's quite a few muscles involved, so it's not just this. So I just wanted to point those 2 unique cervical vertebrae. This is another cervical vertebra. This could be C3 or C7, whatever. All cervical vertebrae have the same characteristics. They have these transverse foramen. Okay, only cervical vertebrae will have these transverse foramen. And what they allow for is the passage of those cranial nerves we studied last semester. Okay, that's the criteria for a cervical vertebra. So let's start with the atlas. Again, here's the atlas. Here's the axis. So no matter what cervical vertebra we're dealing with, they all have the same, except for this dens on the axis. So they're going to have the same things that you need to know for all of them. So let's start with the superior articulating facets of the axis. So these would articulate with the skull. And then we have I'm not going in order either, guys. Underneath, turn it over. These are the inferior articulating processes. These specifically are going to articulate with the superior facets of the axis. Okay? Transverse process, very, very tiny. Transverse process is going to be one of them here and one of them there. Again, here's the transverse foramen. A foramen is a hole here and here. And then we have the vertebral, where'd it go? Vertebral foramen. This allows for the passage of the spinal cord. And I've already told you about the inferior articulating facet. That's just all on the atlas. Slightly different than the regular ones, but we'll go through the cervical vertebrae below the atlas and axis in a little bit. So here's the axis. Turn around so you can see how unique it really is compared to some of the other ones. Okay, so we have the superior articulating facets here and here. And then, of course, we turn it upside down. Here's the inferior articulating facets. These are going to be what articulates to the the vertebrae underneath it or beneath it. Okay. Then we have the body. This is the body of the axis. Transverse process, here's one. Here's the other one. And of course, transverse foramen, those are the holes that give this type of vertebrae that's characteristic. And vertebral foramen for the spinal cord. Okay, so that's the atlas and the axis. Here is an example of C3 through C7, the other cervical vertebrae, very much different than the atlas and axis. So here is the spinous process. This is very large on most of the rest of the vertebrae. So this is the spinous process. This is actually going to be facing towards the posterior and down. So you can see the spinous processes are right here. On the articulated skeleton, they're going to be facing down for obvious reasons. Okay. Once again, we have the superior articulating facets. Sorry, let me focus here. There and there. And if we turn it upside down, we have the inferior articulating facets here and here. And then we can leave it upside down here to show you the transverse processes and the transverse foramen. Okay, not too difficult. So let's get to the thoracic vertebra. Okay, those are the next 12. This isn't a really obnoxiously pointed one with the spinous process. A lot of them get to be that way. If I can show you some of them, they can get really pointy, and you'll notice the spinous processes are facing downward. Okay. So this is the spinous process of this particular thoracic vertebra. You will notice there are no holes, there are no foramen for passage of nerves, because that's only the characteristic of a cervical vertebra. What makes this a thoracic vertebra is, and this isn't a good example, but here and here, there will be facets for the attachments of the ribs. So if you look here at an example of a rib articulating with the facet of this particular thoracic vertebrae, you'll see the tubercle of the rib articulates with this part on the transverse process, and of course, the same on the other side. Okay, that's what makes this a thoracic vertebra, not the fact that it's got real pointy spinous processes, although that is a characteristic. So here's the superior articulating processes, and then of course you turn it upside down, and you'll find the inferior articulating processes of the thoracic vertebra. They have pretty prominent transverse processes. That's because that's where your ribs articulate over here, so they should be pretty big and pretty solid. So that's the articular facet for the tubercle of the rib. When you look at that on your sheet, that's what it'll say on the card. It'll say facet for the articulation of a rib, or tubercle for the articulation for the tubercle of the rib. And then there is no, I guess I didn't put it on there, but this would be the vertebral foramen. The last vertebra we have to talk about is the lumbar. You can see how much bigger it is than any of the other ones. But that's normally what it makes that's how we categorize them. But this huge body right here, this is what makes it really, really different. There's no holes. There's very small transverse processes because we don't need ribs to attach here. And again, there's no transverse foramen. So there are 5 of those. Here's the spinous process. Here are the transverse processes. I'm turning it so that you can see them. And then we have the big body right here. And then, of course, the superior articulating facets. And underneath would be the inferior articulating facets. You are going to need to add that to your list. The inferior articular facets of the lumbar vertebrae. Excuse me, guys. All right, the last thing we need to go through is the sacrum. And actually, the coccyx would hang out here. That would be the tailbone. So there are facets on the sacrum to attach to that last lumbar vertebra. That's how that would go. See that? The inferior facets of the lumbar would articulate with the superior articulating facets of the sacrum. Okay. The median sacral crest, this would be the melding of all the spinous processes of the sacrum used to be 5 separate vertebrae. Now they're fused together. And then the sacral foramina are these holes. And that's it for the vertebral column.